James, what is a cosmological argument?
What is a cosmological argument?
Yeah, because this is one of several I think
Yes.
that have been proposed.
Oh, well, anything that I say here will upset someone. But I would say a cosmological argument is an argument that for the existence of God, which attempts to derive that from some observation about the origins of the cosmos. It's
Right.
distinguished from, say, a teleological or a fine-tuning type argument in that they attempt to derive the existence of God from some feature of the cosmos, such as being fine-tuned for life or the existence of intelligence or something like that. Whereas cosmological arguments are about the origins of the cosmos. And the difference between the different subtypes of the cosmological arguments is in exactly how they try to formulate that.
Right. And, yeah, I'm sorry. I did sort of jump the gun on that a bit, but I was kind of skipping ahead a couple of arguments there. And a part of that is because of an observation that Bryce made. He puts very succinctly, he says that people use the Kalam, that which begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, the universe has a cause. People like to use that conclusion in the Kalam as a premise for a further argument, pick your argument. And it's often the case that it's a teleological argument or something along those lines. Or
contingency, usually.
Contingency, yeah. etc. And then they use that within those arguments, and then they want to go further down the rabbit hole. And it's often the case, we were talking about this briefly before the show, where then they want to start using language to defend these arguments, things like the requirement for things to be perfect. And I hate that language, especially when we're talking in terms of philosophy and theology. To me, anyway, so that was the observation that Bryce had made statistically. So again, just to reiterate, people use the premise for the Kalam as the thing, or excuse me, use the conclusion of the Kalam as a premise for a further argument. And you can use that conclusion to like intuit all sorts of different things.
Craig has formulated the Kalam cosmological argument in slightly different ways in different contexts. The standard formulation that you'll generally see is that the first premise is that everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Right.
The second premise is that the universe began to exist. So the conclusion then being that the universe had a cause.
I didn't realize that he had reformulated it several times. I thought that was just his version of it, what you just said.
Yeah, so it's the form that you'll typically see, and I think it's the older form. In more recent debates, he has reformulated the first premise to be, if the universe began to exist, it had a cause. Now, that is actually a narrower claim, which makes it easier to defend, because some people have objected that, say, particle decays or other quantum processes can occur without causes. And Craig has objected in the past that they're not truly acausal, and even if they are acausal, it doesn't matter because the universe isn't like that. So I think that this second formulation is basically just to avoid any of those issues. That it doesn't matter if there are maybe some things in the universe, like quantum processes or atomic decays or whatever, that could occur without a cause. It's just that all that matters is that the universe couldn't have begun without a cause. But I just use the older formulation because I think it's typically easier.
You can use that sort of language to start then going further down the rabbit hole. And this right here is actually where I this is where I'm on board with the Kalam, because I do think that it is a reasonable thing to conclude that if we have a universe with causes and effects, and the universe began to exist, I do think that our local universe began to exist. I think that therefore there's good reason to conclude that there was a cause for our universe to exist.
Well, wait. So let's examine that. For example, so I want to look at the first premise, and I'm curious about what James's opinion on that. So you said you were going with Craig's first formulation, which is that anything that begins to exist had to have a cause, right?
Yes, although there's a caveat to make there, because in my book, so I don't like the standard formulation of the Kalam that Craig gives, the two-premise form. And there's two reasons I don't like it. The first reason is because Craig has said repeatedly that when he says begins to exist, he means that in a very specific way, which basically entails or requires what is called a tensed view of time. And so that is necessary for the Kalam to get off the ground. Now, there are some people who disagree with Craig there, who think that you can have the Kalam without that. We can maybe talk about that later. But the point is, for Craig's version, he believes, and he has said, that time needs to be tensed. So I actually like to include that as a premise, because if the whole argument can't even get off the ground with this controversial philosophical premise, then I think you should put it in your argument. The second reason I don't like the two premise version is because it's, as it stands, it's only an argument that the universe had a cause. As people have pointed out, apologists always follow this up with further arguments as to why the cause must be personal. So again, if the whole point of your argument and the reason you're delivering it is to get to that God exists, or at least there's a personal creator, then why not just put that as a premise in your argument? So in my book, I reformulate the Kalam as a four-premise argument to include that time is tensed and that the cause must be a personal creator. And the reason I do that is to clearly indicate all of the key issues that Craig needs to establish. So I call that the extended Kalam cosmological argument.
It almost sounds like you're steelmanning the argument a little bit.
Well, I'm just trying to make explicit all of the commitments and issues that need to be discussed, because Craig does discuss these. He just doesn't usually put them in the syllogism of the Kalam. And I just think it's useful to do that for clarity and to help structure my discussion.
What does it mean that time needs to be tensed?
Right. Well, so I've mentioned that a few times because, it's a bit of a discussion in itself. I haven't defined that. So I don't know how much you want to get into this. It's the first thing I actually discuss in my book, because it's one of the things that, well, let me actually step back a bit. It's one of the things that Craig has written a lot about, but doesn't talk much about. So Craig published his Kalam Cosmological Argument as his thesis in, I think it was 1978, or around then. And shortly thereafter, I document this in my book, by the way, for people who would like references on this. But shortly after that, it was made known to him. I am imagining people talk to him about this or something, that his the way he formulated the Kalam is dependent on one particular conception of time in the philosophy of time, and that is called, well, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to call it Presentism, which is the view that only the present exists. The past and the future don't exist, and time is objective and sort of moves forward from the present, which then ceases to be and becomes the past, and the future comes into existence and becomes the present. This is kind of what Craig has in mind when he says something begins to exist. He means it comes into being and then becomes present and comes to exist. So Craig has said that when he formulated the Kalam, he just sort of intuitively thought that time was like that, and apparently didn't really realize that was a disputed point philosophically, or at least didn't give it much thought. So
well, also
subsequently,
in physics, I mean, we have relativity and we have all kinds of other things.
Yeah, we'll get to that, right? But because also in his initial writing, he doesn't really talk much about that. He mentions the Big Bang Theory as scientific support for his for the universe beginning to exist, but his arguments become a lot more sophisticated since then. But anyway, the point is that so he didn't realize the philosophical sort of contention that he did sort of raise there. Subsequently, he wrote a series of 4 books, 4 long, dense philosophical books, like academic books about philosophy of time. In one of them, he critiques the alternate views of time to his, which is called the tense-less theory of time, or sometimes the B theory. Then in another book, he defends his presentist theory of time. In a third book, he discusses the relationship between time and relativity, like scientific theories of relativity, mostly special relativity. And then the fourth book, he talks about the relationship between God and time. So basically to work out all of these issues about how time works, how time relates to, like how time works in physics and relativity, and how God relates to time. Because basically he got himself in a whole lot of hot water about not being clear about this initially. And so he spent many years and a lot of words articulating this. Now, the thing is that although he's written that, he rarely talks about this because it rarely comes up in debates. When it occasionally does, he'll just say, oh, I've written stuff on this, and go and look it up, basically. So I read through a lot of those books, and most of those, and synthesized his arguments and responded to them in the first section of my book there.
Wow. Go ahead, Caleb.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that the way that you put that, because I'm pretty sure that's where we differ primarily, at least initially. Maybe that's one of the first things that'll come up, because I don't buy into that model. I never have, and I actually do.
Which model?
I don't even know what it's called. The model of time Presentism.
Presentism is what Craig supports. The idea that only the present exists.
Yeah, I'm definitely a B theory kind of guy. So I don't. I think that's one of the main reasons why I could never get on board with his line of reasoning beyond that. And so to me, everything that comes out of his mouth after just the Kalam's conclusion is just, as far as I could tell, him projecting his own little personal beliefs onto the world and doing it very, very well, mind you. But I just don't buy that, because, like I said, I don't buy into the necessity of needing this tensed time. If it's possible that our local space-time didn't exist, I don't think that means that all of time didn't exist.